blood dripped from cracked knuckles onto frost-covered leaves, as Silas McKenna stumbled down the mountain path, his eyes wide with terror that no man should ever witness. The crisp November air carried the scent of wood smoke and something else, something metallic and wrong, while his boots crunched through undergrowth that seemed to whisper warnings with every step. This is the story of how 7 experienced moonshiners vanished into the Appalachian wilderness during Prohibition's darkest winter, and why only one emerged to tell a tale so horrifying that he never spoke another word for the rest of his life. Before we descend into those haunted hollers where mountain justice writes its own laws, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in these mountains for nearly a century. The winter of 1925 brought more than snow to the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Federal agents had tightened their stranglehold on illegal liquor operations, driving moonshiners deeper into the backcountry where ancient Cherokee trails wound through valleys that hadn't seen outsiders in generations. The mountain folk called these hidden places the Forgotten Hollers, so remote that maps showed only blank spaces and elevation marks. Charlie Brennan knew these risks when he assembled his crew for what he called the Big Run. As the most successful bootlegger in Harlan County, Brennan commanded respect from both his men and the federal agents who'd been chasing him for 3 years without success. His operation supplied quality liquor to speakeasies from Louisville to Atlanta, moving hundreds of gallons monthly through a network of caves and mountain trails that seemed to shift with the seasons. The crew he chose for this final expedition represented the cream of Appalachian moonshining expertise. There was Tommy the Nose Garrett, who could identify the purity of any liquor by scent alone. Big Jim Caldwell brought muscle and knowledge of the deepest cave systems. The Hutchins brothers, Earl and Wade, handled transportation with an almost supernatural ability to navigate treacherous mountain roads in complete darkness. Young Danny Morrison served as lookout, his sharp eyes capable of spotting federal agents from miles away. And then there was Silas McKenna. McKenna had joined the crew only weeks earlier, recommended by distant cousins in Virginia who vouched for his skills as a distiller. Something about the quiet man troubled the others. The way he watched everything, with calculating eyes. How he asked too many questions about their routes and hideouts. The strange scars that covered his forearms like ritual markings. But Brennan needed skilled hands, and McKenna's references checked out. From the diary of Charlotte Brennan, Charlie's wife, November 20th, 1925. Charlie says this run will set us up for life. Enough money to buy legitimate business, maybe move to Louisville where the children can get proper schooling. But something feels wrong about this trip. That new man McKenna gives me the shivers. The target was ambitious beyond anything Brennan had attempted before. Deep in the forgotten, nearly 15 miles from the nearest settlement, stood the remains of an antebellum mansion called Ravenshollow. Local legends claimed the place was cursed, built on Cherokee burial grounds by a plantation owner who disappeared under mysterious circumstances during the Civil War. The isolation made it perfect for large-scale distilling operations, no neighbors to complain about smoke or smell, no casual hikers to stumble across their equipment. More importantly, Ravenshollow sat atop a natural cave system that connected to underground streams, providing both fresh water and easy distribution routes. Previous scouting trips had confirmed the location's potential. All they needed was enough manpower and equipment to establish a semi-permanent operation that could produce industrial quantities of high-quality moonshine. The expedition departed Harlan on November 21, 1925, at 4 a.m. 7 men loaded with supplies, copper tubing, fermentation barrels, and enough grain to operate for weeks. They traveled in 2 vehicles, Brennan's modified Ford truck and the Hutchins brothers' specially equipped wagon following logging roads that gradually disappeared into game trails as they climbed higher into the mountains. By noon, they'd reached the last point where their vehicles could travel. From there, everything would be packed on their backs for the final 5-mile hike to Ravenshollow. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and snow clouds gathered overhead like dark promises. Brennan studied the threatening sky and made a decision that would haunt him. "We push through," he announced. "Weather's been our friend before, keeps the revenuers close to their warm fires." Something moved in the tree line. The men spent the afternoon ferrying supplies up increasingly treacherous trails. The path to Ravenshollow followed an ancient Cherokee hunting route that switchbacked through stands of oak and hickory, past limestone outcroppings that jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. Wildlife sounds grew scarce as they climbed higher. Even the crows fell silent. McKenna proved his worth during the arduous hike, carrying loads that would challenge men twice his size. But his behavior grew stranger with each mile. He collected peculiar items along the trail: oddly shaped rocks, twisted branches, what appeared to be animal bones arranged in unnatural patterns. When questioned, he claimed they were Cherokee artifacts worth money to collectors in the cities. Big Jim Caldwell found the first warning sign, carved into a massive oak tree, nearly 8 feet off the ground. Someone had gouged symbols that definitely weren't Cherokee. The markings resembled letters, but belonged to no alphabet any of the men recognized. Fresh wood shavings at the base indicated recent carving, though the symbols themselves appeared weathered, as if they'd aged years in mere days. "Probably just some trapper marking territory," Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. They reached Ravenshollow at sunset. The ruins materialized from the forest, like something conjured from nightmares. What remained of the mansion stood 3 stories tall, its Georgian columns still intact, but draped in dead vines that moved without wind. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the front door hung askew, revealing darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. But the structure's condition mattered less than its location. The house commanded a natural clearing surrounded by dense forest, with clear sightlines in all directions. The basement, accessed through stone steps that descended into shadows, opened into the cave system they'd heard about. Fresh water trickled through limestone channels, and the acoustics were perfect for detecting approaching intruders. More disturbing were the signs of recent habitation. Ashes in the main fireplace were less than a week old. Someone had arranged furniture in patterns that served no apparent purpose: chairs facing walls, tables stacked in pyramids, mirrors positioned to reflect nothing but darkness. In one upstairs room, they discovered drawings covering every inch of wall space. Not Cherokee pictographs, but something else entirely. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, diagrams that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. McKenna studied these drawings with intense interest, tracing patterns with his finger while muttering under his breath. What had they found in those forsaken mountains? And why did Silas McKenna seem so familiar with things that should have been completely foreign? The answers lay deeper in Ravenshollow's shadows, where something ancient had been waiting patiently for exactly the right visitors to arrive. But first, the men had to survive their first night in a house that local Cherokee avoided, where even the mountain winds seemed to whisper warnings in languages older than human memory. The darkness was hungry. The grandfather clock in the mansion's foyer chimed midnight with 13 strikes instead of 12. Each additional toll seemed to echo from the limestone caves below, reverberating through foundations that trembled with something more than settling timber. 7 men had entered these cursed ruins, but already the mountain was claiming its due, one piece at a time, one man at a time, until only terror remained. Charlie Brennan tried to ignore the clock's impossible chimes as he organized the first night's watch rotation. The main floor of Ravenshollow offered several defensible positions where lookouts could monitor the forest approaches while staying near the basement entrance where they'd begun setting up distillation equipment. The logical choice was posting men at the shattered windows facing different directions, with others resting in shifts. But logic seemed to warp inside Ravenshollow's walls. Tommy Garrett volunteered for first watch, positioning himself near the front entrance where moonlight filtered through broken shutters. His legendary nose, capable of detecting federal agents from miles away by the scent of their government-issued soap, immediately picked up something wrong. The air inside the mansion carried traces of sulfur, old blood, and something else. Something organic that had been dead far longer than it should be. "Place smells like a battlefield," Tommy muttered, but kept his concerns to himself. The other men arranged their bedrolls in what had once been the mansion's grand parlor, ornate wallpaper, peeled in strips that moved without drafts, and portraits of long-dead plantation owners seemed to track their movements with paint-cracked eyes. Big Jim Caldwell claimed the spot nearest the basement stairs, his massive frame blocking the entrance like a human barricade. Only Silas McKenna seemed comfortable in their surroundings. While the others settled uneasily into sleep, McKenna explored the mansion with the confidence of someone returning home. He traced the strange symbols carved into door frames, with familiar fingers, muttered responses to whispers only he could hear, and arranged small objects, rocks, bones, twisted metal in patterns around their makeshift camp. From the Journal of Earl Hutchins, found later in his abandoned truck, November 21st, 1925. Something ain't right about this place, or about McKenna. Caught him talking to empty rooms tonight, like he was having conversations. When I asked who he was talking to, he just smiled and said, "Old friends." The first incident occurred at 2:37 a.m. Danny Morrison, taking his turn at watch, heard footsteps on the floor above. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from room to room in a pattern that made no sense, crossing spaces where the floorboards had rotted away, continuing through walls that should have blocked passage. The sound was unmistakably human feet wearing heavy boots, but when Danny climbed the dangerous stairs to investigate, he found only empty rooms and dust undisturbed for decades. The footsteps continued directly above his head. "McKenna," Danny called softly. "You hearing this?" But McKenna's bedroll was empty, and none of the other men had seen him leave. The search for McKenna revealed Ravenshollow's first secret. In what had once been the mansion's library, behind a bookshelf whose volumes had long since crumbled to nothing, they discovered a hidden room. The space was small, windowless, and covered floor to ceiling with the same incomprehensible symbols they'd found throughout the house. But these weren't carved into wood or painted on walls. They were burned into the stone itself, as if applied with heat intense enough to melt limestone. The symbols formed spirals that drew the eye inward, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and pictographs depicting human figures in poses of supplication before something vast and tentacled. At the room's center stood a stone altar. Fresh blood pooled in the altar's carved channels, still warm enough to steam in the cold mountain air. The metallic scent filled the small space like incense, and flies buzzed despite the freezing temperature. Whatever ceremony had taken place here was recent within the past hour. McKenna emerged from the shadows behind them. "Found the heart of the place," he said casually, as if discovering blood-soaked altars was perfectly normal. "Knew it had to be here somewhere." Charlie Brennan grabbed McKenna by the shirt, slamming him against the symbol-covered wall. "What the hell is this? What aren't you telling us?" McKenna's response chilled them more than the mountain wind. "I'm telling you exactly what you need to know, exactly when you need to know it, just like they told me to." His eyes reflected the lamplight, like an animal's. "We're not the first group to find this place, Charlie. Won't be the last either. But we might be the most useful." The conversation was interrupted by screaming from outside. They rushed back to the main parlor to find Tommy Garrett pressed against the front window, his face white with terror. Something's moving out there. Multiple somethings. They're circling the house. Through the broken shutters, shapes moved between the trees. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that combined the worst aspects of both. The figures walked upright, but moved with predatory grace, and their eyes caught moonlight with an unnatural gleam. They maintained perfect formation as they circled Ravenshollow, never approaching closer than the tree line, never making a sound. "Cherokee spirits," Big Jim whispered. "We're on sacred ground." McKenna laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Cherokee spirits don't wear federal badges. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. The circling figures weren't supernatural entities. They were federal agents who had somehow found their hidden location. But agents who moved with inhuman coordination, whose eyes reflected light like nocturnal predators, whose silence suggested training beyond anything the Revenue Service provided. Who were these men, and how had they located a hideout that should have been impossible to find? Wade Hutchins posed the question that terrified them all. If those are revenuers, why aren't they rushing us? What are they waiting for? The answer came from McKenna, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing weather. "Dawn," he said simply. "They're waiting for dawn. That's when the real work begins." Outside, the circling figures continued their patient vigil, and the mountains settled deeper into a silence that felt less like peace than like held breath. Something was building toward a climax that would test everything these men thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and the price of entering places where human beings were never meant to tread. The clock struck 3 a.m. with 14 chimes. Time itself was breaking down in Ravenshollow, and morning promised revelations that would shatter the boundary between the natural world and something infinitely worse. Dawn broke over Ravenshollow like a wound splitting open, spilling crimson light across frost-covered ground where impossible footprints circled the mansion in patterns that defied geometry. The circling figures had vanished with first light, leaving only boot prints that started and stopped at random intervals, as if their makers had simply materialized from thin air. What the Moonshiners discovered in those tracks would force them to confront a truth more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. The federal government had been watching them far longer than they'd imagined, and McKenna's arrival was no coincidence. Charlie Brennan knelt beside one of the clearer footprints, his experienced eye cataloging details that chilled him to the bone. The boot tread was regulation federal issue, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that indicated military training. But the print was pressed nearly 2 inches deep into frozen earth that should have been hard as concrete, suggesting either impossible weight or unnatural strength. More disturbing was the spacing between prints. The stride length measured nearly 5 feet longer than any human could naturally achieve while maintaining the perfect silence they'd witnessed. These weren't ordinary revenue agents. They were something else entirely, wearing federal uniforms like costumes. "McKenna," Brennan called. Time for some truth. But McKenna was examining something else entirely. In the mansion's overgrown garden, he discovered a series of wooden posts arranged in a semicircle around what appeared to be a natural depression in the earth. Each post bore carved symbols identical to those inside Ravenshollow, and fresh rope marks indicated recent use for purposes the Moonshiners didn't want to contemplate. From Federal Bureau of Investigation files, declassified 1978, Case File 4427B, Operation Moonfall, Subject McKenna, Silas J. Successfully infiltrated Brennan Organization November 1925. Final phase authorization granted. No survivor's protocol remains in effect. The revelation came piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle made of nightmares. Tommy Garrett found the first federal equipment cache hidden beneath loose floorboards in what had been the mansion's dining room. Military-grade radio equipment, coded communication logs, and detailed surveillance photographs of every member of Brennan's organization dating back 6 months. The photos showed intimate moments, family dinners, private conversations, children playing in yards, demonstrating a level of surveillance that should have been impossible in rural Kentucky. Big Jim Caldwell discovered something worse in the basement cave system. Among the natural limestone formations, someone had constructed an elaborate monitoring station, complete with telephone lines that shouldn't exist in such a remote location. The equipment was sophisticated beyond anything local law enforcement possessed, suggesting federal resources that went far beyond the typical revenue agent's toolkit. But the most damning evidence came from McKenna himself. When confronted with the federal equipment, McKenna didn't deny his role. Instead, he smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term plan was finally coming to fruition. "Bureau recruited me 18 months ago," he admitted casually. "Not for the money, though they pay better than moonshining. They wanted someone who understood what this place really is, what it's capable of." Turns out, federal agents are just as superstitious as mountain folk when it comes to places like Ravenshollow. The operation, McKenna explained, was called Moonfall. The Bureau had been tracking supernatural incidents across Appalachia for years, documenting locations where federal agents had disappeared, where local populations reported impossible phenomena, where the natural laws seemed to bend in ways that defied scientific explanation. Ravenshollow topped their list of high-priority investigation sites. They needed local expertise, McKenna continued, someone who could navigate both the criminal underworld and the other aspects of these mountains. "I've been preparing for this moment my entire life." Earl Hutchins asked the question that terrified them all. "What exactly are you preparing for?" McKenna gestured toward the symbols, covering every surface of the mansion. "Contact, communication, completion of work that started here over 60 years ago when the plantation owner first discovered what lives in these caves." The truth emerged like infection from a festering wound. The federal agents surrounding Ravenshollow weren't there to arrest the Moonshiners. They were there to contain whatever McKenna's presence was designed to awaken. The Bureau had turned their illegal distilling operation into bait for something that had been dormant since the Civil War. But bait for what? The answer lay deeper in the cave system, where limestone passages opened into chambers that predated human habitation of North America. Someone, or something, had carved those passages into a complex maze designed to channel sound, movement, and other forces in ways that human engineering couldn't achieve. Danny Morrison, exploring the caves with increasingly desperate hope of finding an escape route, discovered the chamber where it all began. A circular room, nearly 50 feet across, with walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in lamplight. At the center stood a pool of water so dark it reflected nothing, not even the flames held directly above its surface. Ancient bones littered the chamber floor. Not human remains, but something else entirely. Elongated skulls with too many eye sockets, rib cages that curved in impossible directions, finger bones that stretched nearly 2 feet in length. Whatever these creatures had been, they died in poses of worship around the dark pool, and fresh bones lay among the ancient ones. Recent kills still bearing scraps of federal uniforms and Bureau identification badges. McKenna's colleagues hadn't disappeared. They'd been sacrificed to whatever lived in that lightless water, their deaths feeding something that had been patient enough to wait decades for the right combination of circumstances. Wade Hutchins made the connection that explained everything. "You didn't infiltrate us to arrest us. You brought us here to feed it." McKenna's response confirmed their worst fears. 7 men, 7 souls, 7 keys to unlock what's been sleeping down there since before the Cherokee learned to fear this place. The Bureau doesn't want to destroy what lives here. They want to control it. Imagine federal agents with the power to walk through walls, to see through darkness, to move without sound or footprint. Outside, more figures emerged from the forest. Not the silent watchers from the previous night, but obvious federal agents who moved with human awkwardness and carried conventional weapons. They established a perimeter around Ravenshollow, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough to avoid whatever McKenna was preparing to unleash. The trap was complete, and Charlie Brennan finally understood the scope of their predicament. They weren't just fighting for their freedom. They were fighting to prevent something ancient and malevolent from being weaponized by the federal government. McKenna had spent months earning their trust, learning their roots, understanding their capabilities, all to deliver them to this cursed place at exactly the right moment. But ancient powers rarely distinguish between willing and unwilling servants. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Ravenhollow's ruins, something began stirring in the depths below. Something that had been promised fresh souls and wouldn't be satisfied until it received exactly what McKenna had pledged. The real horror was just beginning. What McKenna hadn't told his bureau handlers was that the entity sleeping beneath Ravenshollow had its own agenda, one that included far more than 7 mountain moonshiners and a handful of federal agents, foolish enough to believe they could control forces older than human civilization. The mountain itself was waking up. The limestone beneath Ravenshollow cracked like thunder at 3:47 p.m., sending vibrations through the mansion's foundation that rattled windows and toppled the carefully arranged federal equipment in the basement. From the dark pool in the deepest chamber came sounds that had no name in any human language, wet, sliding noises, punctuated by what might have been breathing if lungs that size could exist in nature. 6 moonshiners now faced a terrible choice: trust the federal agent who had betrayed them, or descend alone into caves where something ancient was stirring to malevolent life. Charlie Brennan felt the mountains tremor through his boots and recognized the seismic pattern from his mining days. Not an earthquake, but something massive, moving through underground chambers. The sound came from directly below the mansion, rising through limestone passages like a summons that vibrated in their bones. McKenna stood at the basement entrance, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of reluctant cooperation. His true nature emerged with the confidence of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally bearing fruit. The scars covering his arms weren't random marks. They were ritual scarification, symbols that matched those carved throughout Ravenshollow's walls. 63 years it's been sleeping, McKenna said, his voice carrying new authority. 63 years since Judge Thaddeus Whitmore first made contact and learned what real power looks like. The Cherokee knew to leave this place alone, but white men always think they can improve on ancient wisdom. Tommy Garrett backed toward the mansion's front entrance, but found his path blocked by the federal agents who had tightened their perimeter. Through the broken windows, he could see at least 12 armed men positioned in the tree line. They weren't there to arrest anyone. They were there to ensure nothing escaped Ravenshollow alive. From the personal files of Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, discovered in the mansion's ruins, December 15, 1862. The entity beneath agrees to our compact. Southern victory assured in exchange for tribute of precisely measured intervals. 7 souls to wake it, 7 more to bind it, 7 times 7 to command it. The historical record painted a picture of systematic horror. Judge Whitmore hadn't been a simple plantation owner. He'd been the leader of a Confederate occult society that sought supernatural allies in their war against the Union. The ritual chamber beneath Ravenshollow had hosted ceremonies designed to contact entities that predated human civilization, beings willing to trade power for blood. But the entity below had its own understanding of contracts. When Sherman's march reached the Cumberland Mountains in 1863, Whitmore's promised Confederate victory turned to ash. The supernatural ally had honored its agreement in the most literal way possible. The South would never surrender because there would be no South left to surrender. The entity's idea of victory involved consuming everything, Union and Confederate alike. Whitmore died trying to reverse the ritual, his journal documenting increasingly desperate attempts to rebind something that had grown beyond his control. The mansion's hidden room contained his final entry, carved into stone with what appeared to be his own bones. It will not sleep again until the debt is paid 7-fold. Big Jim Caldwell discovered the scope of that debt when he explored deeper into the cave system. The limestone passages opened into a vast underground cathedral, where the walls displayed pictographs chronicling decades of sacrifice. Human figures arranged in groups of 7 led into the chamber by robed priests, their forms dissolving into abstract patterns that suggested absorption rather than death. The pictographs weren't Cherokee artwork, they were Whitmore's records, documenting every group that had been brought to feed the entity below. Escaped slaves, Union soldiers, Confederate deserters, federal investigators, and finally, in the most recent editions, revenue agents and mountain moonshiners. Each sacrifice strengthened the entity, brought it closer to the surface, prepared it for emergence into a world that had forgotten the old warnings about places where the earth grew thin between dimensions. Danny Morrison found evidence of the most recent feeding in a side chamber where federal equipment lay scattered among gnawed bones. Radio sets, identification badges, weapons that had been twisted into impossible shapes by forces that treated metal like clay. The agents who had disappeared over the previous months hadn't been killed. They'd been absorbed. Their knowledge and memories added to an intelligence that grew more cunning with each meal. And McKenna had been feeding it information all along. Every detail about your operation, every escape route, every backup plan, McKenna revealed with obvious satisfaction. It needed to understand modern humans before it could properly hunt them. Federal agents make excellent scouts, but moonshiners know these mountains better than anyone. The entity was learning. Each absorption added new capabilities to its arsenal. From federal agents, it gained knowledge of modern weapons, communication systems, and surveillance techniques. From mountain folk, it learned the secret paths, hidden caves, and survival skills that would make it nearly impossible to track or contain. Wade Hutchins asked the question that terrified them all. What happens when it's strong enough to leave these caves? McKenna's answer painted a picture of horror beyond imagination. The entity didn't simply consume its victims, it replicated them. Every person it absorbed could be recreated as a perfect copy, indistinguishable from the original, except for subtle wrongness in their eyes and an ability to move through darkness without sound. The federal agents surrounding Ravenshollow weren't there to contain the entity. They were the entity, wearing the faces of men who had disappeared months earlier. The Bureau thought they were conducting a supernatural investigation, but they were actually feeding their best agents to something that was using their own resources against them. How many? Brennan demanded. 17 federal agents over the past year, McKenna replied. 3 Cherokee hunters who got too curious. A family of hikers who took the wrong trail. And now you 6. The mountain shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the basement floor, they could hear something vast moving through water. They could feel the pressure of its attention focused upward, like the weight of an ocean pressing against fragile glass. Earl Hutchins made a desperate attempt to reason with McKenna. The Bureau will know something went wrong when their agents don't report in. They'll send more men. McKenna's laughter echoed through the mansion's halls like breaking glass. The Bureau is getting regular reports. Every absorbed agent continues their duties perfectly, filing paperwork, attending meetings, maintaining cover. The entity is patient, methodical. It's been learning how human institutions work, how to manipulate them from within. The true scope of the horror became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident in the Appalachian wilderness. The entity was positioning itself to infiltrate the federal government at the highest levels, to replace key personnel with perfect copies that would gradually reshape policy and procedure to serve inhuman purposes. Ravenshollow was just the feeding ground where it tested its abilities and gathered strength for a much larger campaign. But ancient powers, no matter how cunning, sometimes underestimate the desperation of cornered humans. As darkness began to fall over the Cumberland Mountains, and something unspeakably vast stirred in the depths below, The surviving Moonshiners realized they had one advantage McKenna hadn't anticipated. They knew these mountains better than any federal agent, absorbed or otherwise. The question was whether that knowledge would be enough to escape a trap that had been decades in the making. The thing in the deep places was rising. Water began seeping through Ravenshollow's basement floor at 7:23 p.m. Black liquid that moved uphill and pooled in patterns that defied gravity. The stench rising from these impossible puddles carried the scent of centuries-old decay mixed with something alive and predatory that had never seen sunlight. 5 men now understood that their fight wasn't just for survival. It was to prevent something ancient from using their absorbed knowledge to hunt every soul in the Cumberland Mountains. Charlie Brennan watched the dark water creep across limestone with the methodical patience of someone who understood mountain flooding. But this wasn't natural water behavior. The liquid moved with purpose, flowing around obstacles to form symbols that matched those carved throughout the mansion, creating a living map of passages that connected Ravenshollow to every cave system in the region. The entity below was showing them its true domain. Tommy Garrett's legendary nose detected changes in the mansion's atmosphere that went beyond supernatural phenomena. The air carried traces of federal-issue gun oil, military boot leather, and government-issued soap scents that indicated the absorbed agents weren't just mimicking their former selves, they were somehow accessing their equipment and resources. From outside came sounds of organized activity. The federal perimeter was expanding, with new agents arriving hourly to establish what appeared to be a permanent research station. Vehicle engines, radio chatter, and the methodical sounds of construction suggested they planned to stay indefinitely. Big Jim Caldwell discovered why when he found the real federal communication equipment hidden in the mansion's upper floors. Military-grade radio sets maintained constant contact with Washington, transmitting reports that painted Ravenshollow as a successful containment operation. The entity was using absorbed federal agents to file paperwork, request resources, and coordinate activities that would bring more victims directly to its feeding ground. "It's patient," McKenna said, observing their growing horror with obvious satisfaction. "Been learning human bureaucracy for months now. Knows exactly what reports to file, what budgets to request, what authorization codes to use. The Bureau thinks they're conducting the investigation of the century. Really? They're just feeding themselves to something that gets smarter with every meal." The absorbed agents weren't random copies. They were perfect infiltrators who retained every memory, skill, and clearance level of their originals. The entity could access classified federal databases, coordinate multi-state operations, and requisition whatever resources it needed for expansion, all while filing reports that kept Washington convinced everything was proceeding according to plan. But the entity had made one crucial miscalculation. Danny Morrison, exploring the mansion's hidden passages in desperate search of escape routes, discovered evidence that Ravenshollow's original owner had built more than just a feeding ground for supernatural entities. Judge Whitmore had constructed elaborate containment measures designed to control what he'd summoned, including a system of carved channels that could theoretically be used to drain the entity's power back into the earth. The key was blood. Specifically, the blood of someone who had willingly entered the entity's domain and survived its initial contact. From Judge Whitmore's final journal entry, carved into the hidden chamber's walls, the Cherokee were right about blood debt. What feeds on 7 can be starved by 1, but only if that one chooses sacrifice over survival. The channels will carry the debt back to the deep places, but the price is everything. The revelation sparked desperate hope among the trapped Moonshiners. Whitmore's containment system was still intact, carved into the limestone foundations where it would remain functional regardless of the mansion's decay. The channels formed a complex pattern that could theoretically reverse the entity's feeding process, draining its accumulated power back into the earth where it had originally slept. But the system required activation by someone who had direct contact with the entity, someone it had touched but not yet consumed. McKenna had been in contact with the entity for months, serving as its scout and coordinator. His ritual scars weren't just decorative. They were conduits that allowed limited communication with something that existed partially outside normal physical space. He could activate Whitmore's containment system, but doing so would cost him everything the entity had granted him, including his life. Earl Hutchins posed the question that cut to the heart of their predicament. Why would you help us? You've been working with this thing for months. McKenna's response revealed the complexity of his situation in ways that chilled them more than any supernatural revelation.
Because it's not just absorbing people, it's absorbing their purposes, their goals, their reasons for existing.
Every federal agent it takes makes it more bureaucratic, more systematic, more focused on expansion and control. It's becoming less alien and more governmental. That wasn't part of the original agreement. The entity was evolving beyond McKenna's ability to influence or predict. What had begun as a partnership between human ambition and inhuman hunger was transforming into something worse, a bureaucratic nightmare with supernatural capabilities and an endless appetite for organizational growth. The absorbed federal agents weren't just maintaining cover for their investigation. They were filing requests for expanded operations, increased budgets, and permanent research facilities. The entity was using the federal government's own procedures to establish itself as a legitimate agency with congressional oversight and unlimited resources. Wade Hutchins made the connection that terrified them all. It's not trying to destroy the government. It's trying to become the government. The true horror became clear as McKenna revealed the entity's long-term strategy. Rather than merging as an obvious threat that would unite humanity against it, the entity planned to gradually replace key government personnel until it controlled policy from within. Federal agencies would become feeding grounds, military resources would serve inhuman purposes, and democratic institutions would become tools for systematically harvesting human souls. The process had already begun. According to McKenna's communications with his bureau handlers, similar research operations were being established at supernatural sites across the country. Each location would serve as both a feeding ground and a training facility where the entity could perfect its mimicry of human institutions. But the mountain still held one advantage that no government agency could replicate or control. The Cherokee had learned to fear Ravenshollow for reasons that predated European contact. Their oral tradition spoke of places where the earth grew thin, where ancient things pressed against reality's boundaries, and where human intervention could either strengthen or weaken those barriers, depending on the choices made by those who dared to enter. The Moonshiners weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting to maintain the barriers that kept something vast and hungry from consuming everything they'd ever known or loved. As midnight approached and the dark water continued rising through Ravenshollow's floors, they faced a choice that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone who lived in the Cumberland Mountains. The entity below was preparing for emergence, but Judge Whitmore's containment system offered one last chance to send it back to the deep places where it belonged. The price would be everything. Time was running out, and something that had waited 63 years for this moment would not be denied its due without the kind of fight that legends are built on. The blood debt was coming due. Judge Whitmore's containment channels began glowing with phosphorescent light at 11:58 p.m. Carved limestone drinking McKenna's blood like thirsty earth absorbing rain. The ritual scars covering his arms weren't decorations. They were carefully positioned conduits that connected him to both the entity below and the mountain's ancient defenses. 4 Moonshiners watched in horrified fascination as their betrayer became their only hope for survival. His willing sacrifice the key to sending something unspeakably vast back to the depths where it belonged. Charlie Brennan understood the mechanics of what was happening, even if the supernatural elements remained beyond his comprehension. McKenna had positioned himself at the center of Whitmore's carved pattern, his blood flowing along channels that formed a complex geometric design throughout the mansion's foundation. The phosphorescent glow indicated some kind of chemical reaction between human blood and minerals embedded in the limestone, a reaction that someone had deliberately engineered over 60 years earlier. The entity's response was immediate and violent. Water exploded upward through every crack in Ravenshallow's foundation. Black liquid that moved like living oil, seeking to drown the containment ritual before it could reach completion. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the mansion's walls began vibrating with harmonics that suggested something vast pressing against reality's boundaries with increasing desperation. From the basement came sounds that belonged in no earthly location. Wet sliding noises, punctuated by what might have been screaming if vocal cords that size could exist in nature. The entity was fighting the containment with everything it had accumulated over decades of patient feeding. But Judge Whitmore had designed his system to channel more than just blood. Tommy Garrett felt the change first. His supernatural sense of smell detecting alterations in the mansion's atmosphere that went beyond the obvious supernatural phenomena. The air carried new scents, fear, desperation, and something else that took him moments to identify: hope. The entity's absorbed victims were somehow present in the containment process, their memories and personalities fighting to break free from whatever had consumed them. The absorbed federal agents outside began exhibiting erratic behavior as the ritual progressed. Their perfect coordination dissolved into confusion as competing personalities struggled for control within bodies that no longer belonged entirely to the entity. Some agents dropped their weapons and stood motionless, internal battles playing out behind eyes that flickered between human awareness and inhuman hunger. Big Jim Caldwell realized what Whitmore's true genius had been. The containment system didn't just drain the entity's power, it offered its victims a chance to choose their own fate one final time. Every soul it absorbed is still in there somewhere, McKenna gasped, his blood flowing freely into channels that carried it toward the basement, where something ancient writhed in phosphorescent agony. They can choose to go back to the deep places with it, or they can choose to break free. But breaking free means he didn't need to finish the sentence. Breaking free from the entity meant accepting final death, but death on their own terms rather than eternal absorption into something that violated everything human souls were meant to be. The choice rippled through every absorbed victim simultaneously. Outside, federal agents began collapsing as the personalities within them made their decisions. Some fell peacefully, their faces relaxing into expressions of relief as they chose oblivion over continued existence as parts of something monstrous. Others fought viciously against the containment, their form shifting between human and something else as the entity struggled to maintain control over its accumulated victims. Danny Morrison watched through a broken window as Agent Harrison, a young federal investigator who had disappeared 3 months earlier, stood perfectly still in the moonlight, with tears streaming down his face. For just a moment, the man's true personality surfaced through the entity's control, and he mouthed a single word: sorry. Then he collapsed, his body dissolving into the same black water that was now retreating rapidly into the earth as Whitmore's containment system pulled the entity back toward its original prison. The mountain itself seemed to be assisting the containment. Limestone foundations that had cracked under supernatural pressure began healing themselves, sealing cracks and reinforcing barriers that separated the deep places from the surface world. The Cherokee had been right about the Earth's capacity for self-defense when properly activated by human sacrifice. But the entity wasn't retreating without extracting its own price. Earl Hutchins felt the change in pressure as something vast and ancient focused its attention on the containment ritual with the intensity of a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. The entity couldn't prevent its return to the depths, but it could ensure that anyone responsible for that return would never live to tell the tale. The mansion began collapsing around them, not from structural failure, but from deliberate supernatural assault as the entity used its remaining power to crush everything within Ravenshallow's walls. Beams that had stood for decades suddenly snapped. Floors gave way without warning, and windows exploded inward as invisible forces attacked the building from every direction simultaneously. McKenna's sacrifice had initiated the containment, but completing it would require the Moonshiners to survive long enough for the ritual to reach its conclusion. The entity was betting it could kill them all before Whitmore's system finished draining its accumulated power. Wade Hutchins made the calculation that saved their lives. The basement. If the channels are carved into the foundation, they'll be the last things to collapse. The race to reach the cave system became a nightmare of falling debris and supernatural assault. The entity threw everything it had accumulated at them, absorbed memories of federal training, mountain survival knowledge, and inhuman cunning focused on preventing their escape. Walls shifted to block their path. Floors opened into abysses that hadn't existed moments before, and the very air became thick as syrup, making every breath a struggle. But mountain moonshiners don't survive by accepting defeat when the odds turn against them. Charlie Brennan led his remaining crew through passages he'd memorized during their brief exploration, navigating by touch when supernatural darkness made vision impossible. They reached the ritual chamber just as the mansion's upper floors collapsed entirely, sealing them in the caves with whatever was left of the entity's presence. The dark pool at the chamber's center was draining rapidly, its impossible water retreating into depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the cave system. As the water level dropped, they could see the true scope of what Judge Whitmore had attempted to contain, not just a single entity, but the tip of something vast that extended through dimensions human minds couldn't properly comprehend. McKenna's blood had opened a door, but closing it would require one final choice from the surviving witnesses. The entity's last gambit was as cunning as it was desperate. It offered each of them absorption in exchange for stopping the containment. They could join the federal agents, become part of something larger than themselves, gain knowledge and power beyond human limitations. All they had to do was let it complete its emergence, instead of forcing it back to the deep places where it belonged. The temptation was real, and the entity knew exactly what arguments would appeal to each man's deepest desires and fears. But the mountain had chosen its champions well. The containment reached completion at dawn, and Ravenshollow's secrets sank back into the earth where they had slept for 63 years. Only the question remained: would they sleep forever this time, or merely wait for the next group of humans foolish enough to believe they could control powers older than civilization? Something still stirred in the deepest places. Silas McKenna's body dissolved into phosphorescent mist at dawn on November 24, 1925, his willing sacrifice pulling something vast and hungry back into the deep places where it had waited since before human memory began. The containment channels carved into Ravenshollow's foundation drank his blood like thirsty earth, and the mountain settled back into the kind of silence that suggested equilibrium restored rather than mere absence of sound. 3 moonshiners had survived the night in the caves, but only one would walk out of the Cumberland Mountains with his sanity intact. Charlie Brennan felt the change in atmospheric pressure as Judge Whitmore's containment system completed its work. The oppressive weight that had pressed against their consciousness since entering Ravenshollow lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight, leaving behind air that felt clean and normal for the first time in days. The dark pool at the chamber's center had drained completely, revealing carved stone channels that formed patterns too complex for human minds to follow, but somehow fundamentally right in ways that satisfied ancient instincts about order and protection. But survival came with a price that none of them had anticipated. Tommy Garrett was the first to show signs of what the entity's prolonged contact had cost them. His legendary sense of smell, honed through years of detecting federal agents and identifying liquor purity, now brought him sensory information that belonged in no earthly location. He claimed he could smell the thoughts of people miles away, could detect the fear scent of creatures that lived in dimensions adjacent to their own, could taste the mineral signature of every cave system in the Cumberland Mountains. "It's all connected," Tommy whispered, his eyes reflecting lamplight in ways that suggested fundamental changes to his perception. "Every hollow, every ridge, every stream, the whole mountain range is alive, and it's watching us." Big Jim Caldwell's transformation was more physical than sensory. The massive man found he could navigate the cave system in complete darkness, his hands somehow reading information from limestone walls that guided him through passages he'd never seen before. But the knowledge came with memories that weren't his own glimpses of Cherokee ceremonies, Civil War battles, and decades of federal investigations that had preceded their own encounter with Ravenshollow's secrets. "I remember things I never lived through," Jim said, touching cave walls that responded to his presence with faint phosphorescence. "Like the mountain's been storing every story that ever happened here, and now I can read them all at once." The entity's influence hadn't been completely contained. Some trace of its presence had bonded with the survivors, granting them abilities that came at the cost of their normal human limitations. They could sense supernatural activity across vast distances, could navigate underground passages that weren't on any map, could detect the approach of federal agents hours before normal human senses would register their presence. But the knowledge was driving them toward madness. From the final report of Dr. Marcus Webb, filed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, subject Brennan exhibits symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, but also demonstrates knowledge of classified federal operations that he should have no access to. Recommend immediate isolation and extensive debriefing. Under no circumstances should he be allowed to return to the Cumberland Mountains. Charlie Brennan made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than attempt to lead his traumatized crew back to civilization, where federal agents would question them about events no sane person would believe, he chose to guide them deeper into the mountain wilderness, where they could disappear entirely. The plan seemed logical at the time. They possessed supernatural knowledge of every cave system, every hidden trail, every safe house that had ever sheltered fugitives in the Cumberland Mountains. They could vanish into the backcountry and emerge years later when the federal investigation had moved on to other priorities. But the mountain had other plans for men who had survived contact with its deepest secrets. Tommy Garrett was the first to disappear, somewhere between Ravenshollow and the Tennessee border. He simply walked into a stand of oak trees during their second night of travel and never came out the other side. Charlie and Big Jim searched for hours, following trails that led in circles, calling his name into hollows that echoed with voices that weren't quite human. They found only his boots, arranged neatly beside a limestone outcropping where someone had carved fresh symbols that hurt to look at directly. Big Jim Caldwell lasted 3 more days before the mountain claimed him. He'd been talking increasingly to cave walls, conducting conversations with limestone formations as if they were old friends, sharing gossip about mutual acquaintances. On their 5th night of travel, he walked into a cave entrance that Charlie could swear hadn't existed moments before. The passage sealed itself behind him, like water flowing back together after a stone passes through. Charlie Brennan continued alone, carrying knowledge that no human mind was meant to hold, guided by instincts that belonged to something other than his own species. He could feel the mountain watching him, could sense the patient attention of entities that lived in the spaces between normal reality and the deep places where ancient things dreamed of emergence. But the mountain wasn't hostile toward him, it was protective. The supernatural knowledge he'd gained from exposure to the entity included understanding of barriers and boundaries, of the delicate balance that kept dangerous things contained in the deep places where they belonged. Charlie had become something between human and guardian, forever changed but forever bound to protect others from the kind of horrors he'd witnessed at Ravenshollow. He emerged from the wilderness on December 1st, 1925, stumbling into the town of Hazard, Kentucky, with a story that no one would believe and knowledge that he could never safely share. Federal agents questioned him extensively about the disappearance of his crew, about the missing revenue agents, about events at a location that didn't appear on any official maps. Charlie told them nothing useful, not because he chose to remain silent, but because the words wouldn't come. Every time he tried to describe what had happened at Ravenshollow, his voice failed, his memories blurred, and the only sounds he could make were whispers in languages that predated human speech. The mountain protected its secrets through him, using his silence to maintain barriers that kept ancient horrors from spreading beyond their proper boundaries. But silence came with its own costs. Charlie Brennan lived another 43 years after his encounter with the entity beneath Ravenshollow, but he never spoke another coherent word. He communicated through gestures, through drawings that showed impossible geometries, through arrangements of objects that formed patterns too complex for observers to understand, but somehow fundamentally important. Local people learned to interpret his warnings. When Charlie arranged rocks in certain patterns outside someone's house, they knew to avoid specific caves or mountain trails. When he left twisted branches at crossroads, experienced hikers understood that some paths led to places where human beings weren't meant to tread. He became the mountain's prophet, forever watching for signs that something ancient might be stirring again in the deep places below. The federal investigation into the Ravenshollow incident was classified at the highest levels and buried so deeply that even researchers with appropriate clearances couldn't access the complete files. Official records stated only that a moonshining operation had been successfully disrupted, with all perpetrators either arrested or killed during the raid. No mention was made of missing federal agents, supernatural phenomena, or locations that existed outside normal geographical boundaries. But the Cumberland Mountains remember everything, and some stories refuse to stay buried no matter how deeply bureaucrats try to bury them. Charlie Brennan died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1968. His final gesture, a pattern of stones arranged outside his cabin that warned future generations about places where the earth grew thin and ancient things pressed against reality's boundaries. The stones remain there still, and local people maintain them without understanding exactly why such maintenance feels necessary. Something still stirs in the deepest places, waiting patiently for the next group of humans foolish enough to believe they can control powers older than civilization itself. The stone warnings outside Charlie Brennan's abandoned cabin began rearranging themselves on November 21st, 2023, exactly 98 years after 7 moonshiners entered the Cumberland Mountains, and only one stumbled out, forever changed by contact with something that should have remained buried in the deep places of the earth. Local hikers reported the phenomenon to park rangers who found no logical explanation for stones that moved without human intervention, forming patterns that seemed to warn against traveling specific mountain trails during the darkest nights of the year. The Ravenshollow incident had become legend among Cumberland Mountain residents, a cautionary tale passed down through generations of families who learned to avoid certain hollows when the moon was dark and the mountain winds carried whispers in languages that predated human memory. But legends, like the entities they describe, have a way of refusing to remain safely buried in the past. Dr. Sarah Chen, a folklore researcher from the University of Kentucky, documented the phenomenon in her study of Appalachian supernatural traditions. Her interviews with local residents revealed a consistent pattern of warnings that had been maintained for nearly a century, despite most people being unable to explain exactly why such maintenance felt necessary. From her field notes, October 31st, 2023, interviewed Martha Caldwell, age 87, granddaughter of James Big Jim Caldwell, who disappeared with the Brennan moonshining crew in 1925. She maintains her grandfather's stone markers on the old Cherokee hunting trail, arranging them in patterns her grandmother taught her. When asked why, she simply said, "Some things sleep better when properly watched." The academic investigation into Cumberland Mountain folklore led Dr. Chen to federal archives that shouldn't have existed, classified documents that suggested government interest in supernatural phenomena dating back to the Prohibition era. The files were heavily redacted, but enough information remained to paint a picture of systematic investigation into locations where normal physical laws seemed to bend in ways that defied scientific explanation. Most disturbing was a recent memo dated 2022 requesting renewed investigation into previously contained sites where geological surveys had detected unusual seismic activity. Ravenshollow topped the list of priority locations for immediate reassessment. The federal government was returning to the Cumberland Mountains. Modern satellite imagery revealed construction activity in areas that maps showed as uninhabited wilderness. Roads that didn't appear on any public records, buildings that cast no shadows despite their obvious presence, and electromagnetic anomalies that suggested equipment operating far beyond the technological capabilities of local residents. Something was stirring again in the deep places, and contemporary federal agents were making the same mistakes their predecessors had made nearly a century earlier, believing they could control forces older than human civilization. Local residents began reporting familiar phenomena: federal agents who moved too quietly through mountain trails, equipment caches hidden in caves that shouldn't be accessible to vehicles, and the return of old fears that had been carefully managed through generations of inherited wisdom. The stone warnings multiplied throughout the Cumberland Mountains, appearing overnight in configurations that hurt to look at directly, but somehow conveyed essential information about boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, and places where the earth grew thin between dimensions. Martha Caldwell found Dr. Chen 3 days before the researchers' planned departure from Kentucky. The elderly woman carried a bundle wrapped in Cherokee trade cloth, inside which lay items that had been hidden for nearly a century: Charlie Brennan's final drawings, arrangements of objects that formed patterns too complex for human minds to fully comprehend, but fundamentally important for reasons that transcended rational understanding. "My grandmother said someone would come asking the right questions eventually," Martha explained. "Said when that time came, we'd need to share what Charlie left behind, even though sharing it means the watchers might not be enough to keep things contained." The drawings depicted maps of cave systems that extended far beyond any known geological surveys, showing connections between Ravenshollow and dozens of other locations across multiple states. Each site was marked with symbols that suggested similar entities sleeping in similar deep places, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to attempt emergence into the surface world. Charlie Brennan had spent 43 years of silence documenting a network of supernatural threats that spanned the entire Appalachian mountain range, using knowledge gained from his encounter with the entity beneath Ravenshollow to map boundaries between the normal world and places where ancient things dreamed of conquest. His final drawing showed a timeline that ended in 2025, exactly 100 years after his original encounter with forces that existed partially outside normal time and space. The centennial was approaching, and something vast was stirring in preparation for an emergence that would make the Ravenshollow incident seem like a minor disturbance compared to what was planned for the modern world. Dr. Chen's research took on new urgency as she realized the federal agents currently investigating supernatural sites weren't there to contain anything. They were there to facilitate contact with entities that had been learning about human civilization for a century, perfecting their ability to mimic government institutions while waiting for the optimal moment to replace them entirely. The pattern was repeating on a scale that dwarfed anything Judge Whitmore had imagined when he first attempted to bargain with powers beyond human understanding. Modern technology had given the entities new possibilities for infiltration and control, while bureaucratic complexity provided perfect camouflage for inhuman intelligence operating within human institutions. But the mountain still remembered its guardians, and some warnings transcended the boundaries between legend and reality. On her final night in the Cumberland Mountains, Dr. Chen experienced what local residents had been describing for decades: the sense of being watched by something vast and patient, something that had been waiting nearly a century for the right moment to complete work that had been interrupted by 7 moonshiners and one man's willing sacrifice. She left Kentucky with Charlie Brennan's drawings and a promise to Martha Caldwell that the warnings would be preserved, that someone would continue watching the boundaries between the normal world and the deep places where ancient things pressed against reality's barriers with increasing desperation. The stone markers continue to rearrange themselves throughout the Cumberland Mountains, forming patterns that local residents maintain without fully understanding why such maintenance feels like the most important work they've ever done. And every November 21st, hikers report seeing a solitary figure walking the old Cherokee hunting trails. A man who moves without sound, who arranges objects in complex patterns, who seems to be checking barriers that separate the surface world from something vast and hungry that still stirs in the deepest places of the earth. Some say it's Charlie Brennan's ghost, forever bound to guard against the return of horrors he helped contain through willing sacrifice. Others believe it's something else entirely, a manifestation of the mountain's own protective instincts, given form by generations of people who understood that some boundaries must be maintained regardless of the cost. But on the darkest nights, when the wind carries whispers in languages older than human memory, even the skeptics avoid certain mountain trails where the earth grows thin and ancient things press against reality's boundaries with the patience of entities that measure time in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. The mountain remembers everything, and some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deeply bureaucrats try to bury them, or how much time passes between one generation of guardians and the next. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.